So first of all, I just want to say thank you to you for showing up and being a part of my journey in this doctoral program. So it's only in academia that someone would give you 8 minutes to present something that took you about 40 hours to put together on PowerPoint and a lifetime of work to make sense of. But alas, will you participate with me a little bit more? I have a list of things here. So just if you've experienced one of these things on the list, could you put your hand up and leave it up for a moment? So have you been in a car accident? Have you been exposed to a war zone as a soldier or a civilian? Have you lost a child either before or after death? Have you experienced a cancer diagnosis? Just leave your hand up in the room. And so we have some more. Have you been witness to a natural disaster? Have you experienced physical or sexual assault? Have you been taken hostage? Or have you lost a close friend to suicidal death? And so now take a look around the room and see that you are indeed in good company. And so most of us at one point in our lives have experienced something that we might call potentially traumatic. And so I took this screenshot a few days ago from my computer. So I Googled trauma and Canadian Armed Forces members, and you can see this is the first 4 hits, but I can tell you that the next 4 pages are all about post-traumatic stress disorder. And most of them also include components of suicide. And so when you look at the bottom as well, these are the other related searches. And in there, you might argue that the term trauma in our culture has become almost synonymous with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the label that we put on someone who experiences it. Not to say that PTSD is a bad thing or the diagnosis is a bad thing. So I want to give credence to actually in the 80s, it was largely as a result of Vietnam War veterans who lobbied to have their symptoms acknowledged when they came back from war. And so that's actually where it comes from, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it really, in our model, has become the portal to actually getting treatment and moving forward with it. It's not new. Perhaps the diagnosis came out in 1980, but we used to call it things like soldier's heart or shell shock, or so you may have heard those terms previous to PTSD. But today what I want to bring to your attention is this idea that we can actually grow positively as a result of our experience with trauma. And so I want to make an argument to open our aperture, our viewpoint of what we may talk about when we talk about trauma. And so what is post-traumatic growth? Well, it's the idea that we can actually change positively as a result of our struggle with the experience with potentially traumatic events. And so I'll leave this for just a few seconds for you to read here. So somebody who doesn't understand growth may actually think that it looks like complete destruction. The idea of post-traumatic growth is also not new. So it's been around for thousands of years. The Buddha went around the world talking about how suffering is the route to enlightenment. And if the Buddha is not your thing, then maybe you like Batman, who saw his parents murdered as a child, and then he dedicated his entire life to a sense of purpose and meaning by saving Gotham City. Okay, so there are some myths about post-traumatic growth. It's largely still as a theory. So you'll prevent PTSD if you can facilitate post-traumatic growth. This is indeed not true. And you see in the definition of growth actually that we don't grow as a result of the trauma in and of itself. We grow as a result of the struggle with trauma. You don't have to have PTSD or any other negative consequence necessarily to experience post-traumatic growth. Not everybody will experience it, or maybe some people will experience it in some areas and not in others, and you are certainly not a failure if one of the outcomes that you experience as a result of trauma is not growth. Resilience, a related concept, is also sometimes communicated as one of the results of trauma, and so indeed you are not a failure if you experience resilience and not growth. But more importantly, I'm looking at growth from an interesting perspective that truly hasn't been examined very much thus far. And so this is a picture of Kelly Slater. He has 11 world titles in surfing competitions. He's a wonderful human being. At the top, you can read this quote, "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." It comes from the mindfulness tradition. Have you heard it before? From Jon Kabat-Zinn. And indeed, that's true, that you can learn to deal with life's struggles. And if you don't like Kelly Slater, then perhaps you like Bethany Hamilton. She had her arm bit off by a shark while surfing, and she actually grew from the experience, created a modified surfboard, and came back to surfing with one arm following it. But I can tell you that surfing is much easier if you have a surfboard, if you have a better instructor than this one, And if you have some conditions that actually support you being able to learn and to grow from your experiences. And so I am looking at growth in the face of trauma with an ecological model, and in my line of work in psychological wellness, what this means is that we're looking at the relationship between the individual and his or her surrounding environment. So most of the research that's been done in psychological wellness, particularly related to trauma and resilience, has been done from a post-positivist standpoint, looking at the individual as a locus of change. And this is great. This is all wonderful research. And what I want to do is augment our understanding of it by turning the binoculars in the other direction and looking at a person's environment, and actually more importantly, the relationship between that person's environment and themselves, because we know that health is not just don't smoke, don't drink, eat good food, and whatever else. Also, there are other determinants of health, including your gender, your socioeconomic status, your power, your healthcare system. 25% of your health actually can be attributed to your healthcare system. And so my research question is still quite broad at this point in my research journey. I want to know what are the factors that contribute or that breed post-traumatic growth or the potential thereof for members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I use this just to give you an idea of what ecology means in my line of work. And so you see the individual in the center of this circle, and then from there you see they actually have a relationship with their family and their friends, and then their community, and then their leadership, and it gets more ethereal as we go out from here. I am using intersectionality as part of the framework for critically understanding the complexity of the problem of how you actually study something ecologically. So I'll give you one example. If you look at the top center here, one of the 6 suggested areas of inquiry for intersectionality is power. So in the Canadian Forces, I want to know, does your experience of potentially growing change if you're a private of the lowest rank or if you're a general of the highest rank, for example? And I want to know, in the more grand scheme of things in culture, does the speed at which we move contribute to our experience of potentiating environments that allow us to grow? And yeah, so I'm looking at the problem. I'm suggesting a mixed methods approach to the problem. So what I want to do is an interpretive phenomenological analysis. I should get a medal for actually being able to say that out loud. And then I want to use these, what I want to do is inquire into the lived experience of post-traumatic growth, particularly for members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And then I want to add that to what already exists out there in the literature on studying from an ecological standpoint when it comes to trauma and growth. And I want to create something to test on real human beings with an experimental design within our community. So I want to know, does it work? But I want to make sure that I'm doing it from a tuned standpoint first. And of course, this is Tuesday of 3 weeks, and so that changed 7 times since a couple of weeks ago, and so I'm sure it will change again. For the first years who might be interested in the more academic aspects of my research, I come at it from a very pragmatic standpoint. So I'm less concerned necessarily about pitching myself against another camp. What I really want to do is to create real world change and to transform the way that we see things in our culture, and I want to do it from a place of attunement, and I'm invested in it because I am a serving member of the forces, and I have many brothers and sisters who still serve, so it matters to me to do it in a good way.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As Runa mentioned, the title of my topic is Reframing Memory, Time and Place, the Transformation of German Remembrance in the Age of New Media and the Rise in Populism. So my one set of grandparents were too young to be part of the war generation, but my other set of grandparents were. And when I was younger, it didn't occur to me that I would engage in a detailed discussion with my grandfather about his first-hand narrative of the Second World War. Perhaps because I was a teenager, or perhaps because I wasn't aware of the fact that I was going to do my doctorate in this subject, or perhaps because most of the stories shared of the Second World War were silenced in our family. I was born in Germany, but I grew up in the Middle East, which means that I never got to experience learning about my own heritage and my culture in a German school system. So all the stories that I know and that I'm aware of have been reconstructed and reinterpreted by my parents, my family, and my friends. Now, I would like to introduce you to my grandfather. His name was Walter, and he's definitely a key inspiration for me to partake in this journey. He was 18 years old when he was conscripted to the military, and he wasn't able to return home for 6 years. And as part of this research, I'm hoping that I will be able to, in a way, trace his footsteps and his memory, and to a certain extent, be able to experience his firsthand narrative. Now, I could do that, for example, by looking at artifacts, such as a collection of letters of war. My family has a few of those, and for most of them I'm unable to read them just because of the type of German language that was used, but just even phrases or words or dates and locations help me reconstruct that specific part of my past. So I'm sharing this story with you today because it's one way that individuals such as myself, a German millennial, can incorporate the past of Nazi war heritage into their collective narrative today. I'm interested in exploring this topic because there is an evident evolution of culture, and this is supported by the literature, and therefore I'm interested to know how the transformation of remembrance occurs into education across generations. Let me give you an example. Since last October, I was involved in a pilot project with the Dachau tour guides in Germany, and one of the responses from one of our participants is the following, and I'm just going to give you a couple moments to review the quote. Now, I'm sharing this example with you because I think it represents the fact that there is a dissonance and disconnect in culture and in society in regards to what we hope people walk away with from their visits and sites of memory and what they're actually thinking they might want to experience. So therefore, my research question is, how do German millennials who visit sites of Nazi war heritage incorporate the Holocaust into their collective narrative? Now, I can look at this problem or social issue from two perspectives. On the one hand, populism. Over the last couple of years, there's been an evident increase in right-wing parties and the passion or the support for right-wing parties in Germany. There's been an increase in right-wing activism, an increase, unfortunately, in vandalism all across Europe. And this map shows that even though Germany is a slightly lighter blue color, which means that there's not yet as a dominant amount of population that support right-wing political parties, you can still see that on average in the little pie chart in the center, that on average more people are favoring right-wing ideologies. So specific to Germany, the re-elections that started last year in October, we can see that the right-wing political party, which is the blue-colored graph, is now the third biggest in parliament, and in fact, for the first time ever in history, that they were able to receive seats in parliament. Now, another way we can look at it is through new media and the increase in and usage of technology. So this is a graph that shows big data, and it helps me to situate my research inquiry in the global context. And I'm showing this to you because I'm hoping that we can take away from this is that looking at both of these trends, that the fact that the discussions around new media and millennials increased, why don't we use that as an opportunity to be able to incorporate discussions around the Holocaust, the Second World War, and Nazism into our collective narrative today? We could also look at it at a more local level. So for instance, on average, millennials spend 39% of their day engaging with their smartphones versus engaging with their family members or friends. So specific to my research, we could transform it into this way and of course argue and debate about whether or not this is an issue. I would like to show you some pictures now and would just like to ask you to reflect personally on them about your possible assumptions. Now, I'm sure that many of us would agree that the majority of our assumptions are perhaps slightly rather negative. So we might we may be thinking things like they're showing irresponsible behavior, why are they feeling no shame, disrespectful, they're out of place, or they're totally unaware. But what if I told you that, for example, in this case, she was studying the Holocaust and the history of it with her father, so she did this as a trip in the anniversary of his death. It's all to say that, and I would like to use the words from this quote, that nowhere does memory crystallize with a more powerful and oppressive force than at those historical sites and places where the events shaping this very remembrance and determining memory occurred, the authentic sites of history. I'll be looking at dark tourism sites, which are essentially engineered and orchestrated places of remembrance of mortality and fatality. And a dark tourist is somebody who travels to those sites partially motivated to be able to encounter those symbolic interactions with death. Now, some sites of memory that we may be all aware of, for example, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam receives 1.3 million visitors annually, United States Holocaust Museum 1.5, and Auschwitz 2 million visitors. More specific to my research, I'll be looking at sites of memory in Germany. So for instance, the Dachau Camp Memorial Site receives 900,000 visitors annually, and the Nazi Party rally grounds, 250,000. I'll be looking at critical ethnography as for my methodology because it's committed to addressing social injustice and inequality. And I'll be doing my analysis through narrative inquiry and socio-historical and dialectic approaches. As for my methods, I'm proposing a mixed methods approach at this moment, mainly focusing on qualitative approaches. And I would just like to highlight the reflexive vignettes because I think that one will be, in a way, the strongest one for my research because it allows me to incorporate my own positionality and have my voice as a researcher heard in my dissertation. And as for my conclusion, I'm hoping to be able to contribute to theory of change in the form and partially in the form of a photo voice project. And I'm hoping that the photographs that are contributed by German millennials not only let us understand their narrative and how they're incorporating it in society, but also lets us learn the transformation from remembrance to education in the 21st century. Thank you.
I don't have to tell anyone here that affordable housing is a critical policy issue today. We're in Victoria, it's one of the hotspots, across the coast from Vancouver, one of the other hotspots. What you may not know is that affordable housing is not just an easy term to just sort of throw out. So affordable housing is actually reflective of a continuum of types of housing, from emergency shelters all the way to affordable home ownership. And so there's everything in between, including what we call subsidized housing or social housing. And that's where I'm sort of focusing my research. So full disclosure, I work for one of the largest social housing providers in Edmonton. My role is to sit in sort of that mix between the policy and research side and the frontline delivery side. So I get to see the impact of what all the rules and the policy decisions that are made on the people who come into the system. And for those of you who don't live and breathe social housing, just a quick sort of 101. In order to be eligible, you have to, for your entire household, that includes anyone over the age of 15, have all of your household income declared, and then be under a certain income threshold that is calculated for each individual municipality. So for Victoria, for a one-bedroom, which would serve either a single person or a couple without children, your income threshold is $35,500. That's pretty standard across the country, actually. The one that's sort of a bit of an outlier is Fort McMurray, but that's also just because it's also Fort McMurray. Once you know that you've met the income threshold, you also then have to look at your assets. So you have to declare all of your assets. A number of them are excluded, but then you can only have so many assets. In BC, it's $100,000. In Alberta, it's $25,000, and some of the other provinces are sort of in between there. Once you know that you've met the asset threshold, then you also have to look at what your citizenship status is. There's limitations on who can be served. Notably, those who are in a private sponsorship situation are not allowed into social housing unless the private sponsorship is broken down. Only then, when you're determined to meet all of those criteria, you get then decided to be placed based on your priority and need. And each province and each system has a different sort of way of determining who gets priority. So you can imagine as you go through this process, how demoralizing, how intrusive it can be. And then often the answer you get is, great, you're on a list. And then you wait. And your wait can be a couple of weeks. It can also be a couple of years. And your life sort of goes on, but you're still trying to sort of tie yourself to this system. And if you are in, then that's great. You're paying 30% of your income towards your rent, which is calculated on a whole different algorithm that you guys don't necessarily need to know about because it's really boring. But you also then have to continually show that your income is at a certain level to be able to either have your rent calculated, or in Alberta, once you're over the income threshold that you were deemed to be eligible for, we actually have to evict you. So you can imagine how sometimes heartless this system is feeling to people who are actually in need quite a lot of housing, and how foundational housing is for you to be able to layer everything else for your life in when you have a safe and affordable place to live. So just a sense of sort of the social housing context is important to understand why I'm now looking at an intersection between social housing and well-being. So the sense of subjective well-being has increased over the last number of years, where governments are starting to now use it as a way of measuring how a society is growing. So it used to be just firmly looking at GDP. That was a sense of, you've got economic growth, clearly the country's doing well. Now we're looking at what's the level of subjective well-being for a country, a community, or individuals. And subjective well-being is defined a number of different ways, but essentially you're looking at your life satisfaction, how you're feeling, and that can be positive or negative, and a number of other factors, and it's multidimensional. So you're looking at people's physical health and mental health, but also their relationships and their sense of belonging and sense of community, and their feeling of safety and security. And so why is this important in particular now? It's great to say there's a measure and governments are using it, but what's happening is it's also becoming more and more important and informing public policy, and particularly social policy. And we're now seeing, with the introduction of a national housing strategy last year, and some other provincial and territorial strategies that have been introduced over the last couple of years, there's an increasing linkage between safe and affordable housing and someone's increased well-being, or someone's increased social inclusion and economic inclusion. And that's great, that's really important. However, what's not being talked about a lot is how the system can actually enable those that are living in the system how to increase and support and promote their well-being. There's a huge gap in this. And one of the challenges is that this system tracks a lot of information. You can imagine how much personal information we have about people. You can imagine how much information we have about the costs of homes and turnovers and maintenance costs, but we don't actually have a lot of non-housing outcomes. So it becomes really difficult not only to do a quantitative side of your research, but also to figure out how we're even talking about increasing someone's sense of well-being in this system. And I'm intentionally keeping it at a systems level. My interest is looking at that regulatory framework, the policy system and structure that exists around this. It's a heavily regulated system. And so essentially my research question is, how do we best design a social housing system that supports and promotes the well-being for those who are living in the system? And how I'm doing that is looking at the 4 Western provinces, so I'm using a comparative analysis approach or methodology, and choosing the 4 Western provinces. BC has a larger strength in terms of its research on social housing. The Prairie provinces don't in so much, so I'm also running into a little bit less research that's already been documented. And unlike traditions in England and the Netherlands, there's also less just generally in Canada in terms of looking at social housing. So I'm hoping that this will also contribute in a way to that body of research for other people to be able to keep going in this area. But in terms of looking at that, so looking at what are the systems, how are they existing now? Is it just a policy issue? Is there a role for housing providers to be able to do this? And comparing it and trying to come up with sort of what elements may be in existence now or should be in existence that would help really create that system that we now all want to move towards. Okay.
Individuals with developmental disabilities in the province of British Columbia have a history of isolation, shame, and worthlessness. They still seek social justice. The end of the eugenics movement in 1984, followed by the closure of the last institution in our province in 1996, brought individuals with developmental disabilities into our communities. Inclusive education has existed in British Columbia for approximately 30 years, and that has brought youth into our neighborhood schools. Still, despite these points of change, there's still learning that needs to happen. We are far from the ideal. My research focuses on youth aged 14 to 25 who have developmental disabilities and their parents. The purpose of my research is to collect the narratives of the lived experience of these youth and their parents to inform the transition planning process that includes the decade of time that spans the movement from high school into adult services. My dissertation seeks to understand and make sense of the experiences that these youth have during those years. And in addition, I hope to understand the societal, institutional, and cultural factors that influence the identity making, and ways that I, as a researcher, and my participants can find points of change to improve the system of transition. The need for research. There's a number of needs for research, including the dominant positivistic systems that are in place within our province, including Community Living British Columbia, the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Children and Family Development, which are the three primary institutions that support individuals with developmental disabilities in our province. They use categorization of individuals with developmental disabilities to identify service provision for them, and that's a very positivistic way of looking at individuals. We have a dominant identity of disability that is assigned to individuals with disabilities by the school system, sometimes by home, and by society, which limits their movement and limits their opportunities to engage in experiences within the community that builds their identity. We have individuals with developmental disabilities who are not recognized as knowers, and therefore their ideas are not considered in decision making, and their parents who are shuffled to the side at the point of diagnosis by the medical system and by the school system as our team of experts come in to deal with our children, and our children suddenly become a case or a number. And lastly, the Cross-Ministry Transition Planning Protocol for Youth with Special Needs, which came out in 2009, and it was promised as this panacea of change within the transition planning community. And it called for an evidence-based, collective, collaborative, and cohesive transition planning process for youth with developmental disabilities. And while it's brought some structural change to the system, so it's easier to go from the Ministry of Children and Family Development to the Ministry of Community Living BC, it hasn't made any strides towards developing an evidence base, nor has it made any strides towards this cohesive and collaborative transition plan itself. So my ologies are, where do I situate myself in the world? Epistemologically, I'm solidly in the transformative paradigm. So my goal is to provide or to look for change within the province around the transition of youth with developmental disabilities. My methodology is narrative inquiry. So narrative inquiry is developed in the late 1980s, and it's a Canadian phenomenon, and it looks at collecting the narratives of individuals and using those as your evidence base. It truly recognizes the voice of all individuals participating in the research. It's a dialectic process of storytelling and retelling as a foundation for change. My ontology, I'm solidly, Dewey is the underpinning of narrative inquiry, so his book, Experience and Education, is the underpinning of narrative inquiry, and Dewey believes that each person's experience is what gives them knowledge. And so therefore, one person's knowledge can't be valued over another person's knowledge. So that is an important concept when working with individuals with developmental disabilities, because often their knowledge has been set to the side. And my axiology is pretty straightforward, social justice. A research question: how can the knowledge constructed from narratives of youth with developmental disabilities aged 14 to 25 and their parent improve long-term planning across a decade that includes the transition from high school to adult services in British Columbia? My sub-questions: how do the experience of youth with developmental disabilities affect their identity formation? How does a deficit-based approach to service delivery in provincial institutions affect identity formation for youth with developmental disabilities and their parents? And lastly, how can the parents of youth with developmental disabilities support the self-determination of their child? Participants, I'm looking for individuals who fit the requirements of the transition planning protocol. By their definition, are youth between the ages of 14 and 25 who have developmental disabilities or an IQ below 70. and one of their parents to participate in this. Recruitment will be through emails going out through various disability support groups within our province. I'm hoping to get 20 participants altogether. I want to see if there's differences between urban and rural and Indigenous populations of families who have children with developmental disabilities. So I'm hoping for 8, 8, and 4 within the different groups to see if there's differences amongst their responses. My methods, I'm going to be using mixed methods, but primarily qualitative methods is my main one, so I'm using narrative inquiry. And in narrative inquiry, there's 3 components. So there's the collection of the data, the narratives from the individuals, which is part of the field experience. Those are then can be converted into field text through the restoring or the retelling of the narratives that are collected. And finally, there's the grounding in the research to the production of the research text. Now I know that I'm working from an actor-agency perspective between some really enormous institutions, and I don't want to end up like this guy here. So I know that I need to speak their language, which will require some numbers and a little bit of math. So I'm going to be using some quantitative methods as well, particularly to look at my second sub-question, which is around factors that are related to self-determination. So I'm going to be coding all my narrative using the Nussbaum's 2011, the 10 central capabilities of the human development approach. So I'm going to be using those capabilities and coding the data and juxtaposing that to the Ministry of Education's categories of deficits. So if you have an intellectual disability in the province of British Columbia, your IEP goals or your education is based around 3 deficit areas. So I'm going to be juxtaposing the stories, juxtaposing the coding between those 2. So it's a little bit of a critical paradigm that I'm going to be using there. I'm going to do some crosstabs and some fancy stuff, and we're going to come out with some numbers that will hopefully lead to this goal at the top, which is to show the impact of a deficit-based model against a holistic model, to encourage looking at the whole child instead of looking at the disability of the individual. My hope for research outcomes, I wanted to share with you, to top this, or to end the presentation, some of my parental worries as my son tries to find his way in the world as an autonomous, knowing entity unto himself. The consistent devaluing of individuals with developmental disabilities pushes my research forward for me and for thousands of other parents within the province of British Columbia who are going through this process each year. Because narrative inquiry relies on language devices such as imagery, metaphor, simile, and description, I wanted to create a image for you guys as listeners. So I want to use a metaphor that describes the current transition process and my worry as the dominant social construct of disability impedes our progress. When I think about the transition from high school to adult services, a process that spreads over a decade of time, I think about the Leo Leone story, Fish is Fish, in which a minnow and a tadpole are friends. The tadpole grows legs and goes onto the land and then comes back to tell the fish about the wonders that he has seen. The fish then tries to follow the frog onto the land because he imagines the wonders the frog has described as better than his water habitat. What if my son is a tadpole becoming a frog in the transition between high school and adulthood to emerge into the wonders of the world? However, he's not recognized as knowing, and he isn't given the chance to emerge, so he's kept in the safety of the shallow water's edge instead. Neither fish nor frog, neither fully in nor fully out of society. I want my son to walk in the bright sunlight of life on land, to be seen, to be included, to be the best version of himself, created through the restoring of lived experiences, learning, stretching, and growing in confidence to leave the shallows. I not only want this for my son, but I want this for all youth in transition in the province.